Local newspapers say the sky in Woodward, Oklahoma was unusually red on the morning of April 9th, 1947. While some consider it a superstition, a red sky at dawn can indeed indicate inclement weather. The particles in the air when a pressure front is approaching give the sunrise or sunset a deep red hue. Yet today, the red sky would herald more than just inclement weather. Woodward was in the path of imminent and serious danger. A state over, near the edge of Texas, a supercell was brewing. White Deer, Texas, was the first place the tornado touched down. With an F2 tornado bearing down on the town, H.W. Holmes, a local man, gave his account of the start of the storm in the Mangum Daily Star. Quote, "I thought at first it was an old Texas panhandle dust storm, and then I saw the funnel. I was standing in my front yard in White Deer, and suddenly a black cloud formed outside of town. It turned toward White Deer. Suddenly there was a funnel, and then a rumble. It sounded like a fast freight train as it moved in. I was about 3/4 of a mile from where it hit, and it looked like it was taking a strip 200 yards wide, following the Santa Fe Railroad tracks. It hit an oncoming freight train just outside of town, and they tell me that 19 cars and 2 cabooses went off the rails. I didn't see that because debris was filling the air as far as I could see. The rumbling thing did an awful lot of damage. It finally hit the edge of town, then it paused for a moment, and the funnel lifted in the air. It looked like some giant hand had lifted it up. The cloud sailed away towards Oklahoma, and that's the last I saw of it." The people of White Deer had no way to warn anyone of the upcoming disaster, because it just so happens that the country was in the middle of a nationwide telephone operators strike. Management and those exempt from the union were still on guard for emergencies, but the nation wouldn't have been monitoring the storm, and the people of White Deer were largely left without electricity, let alone phone lines. And so, the tornado passed through Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, each town that it struck having no idea it was coming, and afterward, having no way to call for immediate help.
Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion.
The tornado was initially thought to have been on the ground the entire time, but later, experts determined that it was a series of different tornadoes from the same storm, touching down over a path of 125 miles. The second tornado touched down and dissipated near Pampa, Texas, but only in a field and didn't hurt anyone. The third and final tornado formed near Canadian, Oklahoma. This tornado was an F5 with winds as high as 440 miles per hour. It's the deadliest tornado in recorded Oklahoma history. It narrowly missed Miami, but started to pick up more casualties when it crossed back into Texas. In Codman, 1 person was killed, but when the tornado hit Glacier, it wiped out the small community completely. As it was a rural area, the casualties totaled just 17. As it swept through Higgins, it left 51 dead and destroyed much of the town. When it crossed the border again, it missed any major cities or towns first. 6 people living in farming communities in Oklahoma were killed as it sped across the rural parts of the state. The calamity hit Woodward around 8:43 p.m. Franklin Stetcher, the local funeral home director who survived the tornado, said, quote, "Wind began to blow. It became quite fierce, and we huddled back in the corner of the room to watch the windows blow out and the electric light lines bounce down the street." Citizen Ray Goebel Jr. said, quote, "When the tornado hit, I stepped out on the front porch, and I saw this car coming down the street, with all 4 wheels locked up, and the wind was pushing it down the street, and I knew we were in trouble then." Nearby, Ray's sister, Cleta Croft, and her family were in serious trouble. The tornado flattened their house in an instant, and took Cleta with it, when a wall fell on her. She died instantly, and her husband, Olin, was critically injured and trapped under the rubble. Their 2 daughters, Jerry and Joan Gay, escaped the rubble, but both were covered in abrasions. Joan Gay had a large piece of wood, larger than a pencil, that had pierced clean through her calf. She also had a head injury and numerous cuts on her face. And Jerry was also very bruised up, with several abrasions that might need to be treated. Though all sources largely agree on the details of the tornado itself, when getting into the story of the Croft family, things start to become a bit less clear. Due to the age of this case, many of the sources conflict with one another, adding an additional challenge when trying to reconstruct the lives of Joan and her family. The Woodward Daily News has not been digitized, so no articles are available at this time from the local news, though they would certainly have been in the midst of rebuilding and wouldn't have been able to cover the immediate aftermath of the tornado anyway. So, the sources that are likely to be the most reliable are other Oklahoma newspapers that were covering the story as it developed. But even among local papers from the time, there were a lot of discrepancies. Joan Gay and Jerry were likely 4 and 7 years old respectively, but some articles place Joan Gay at 3 or 5. But the articles that list an approximate date of birth all list her at 4.5 years old. Jerry's age is more consistent. She's usually mentioned to be 7 years old, but Jerry's name is very inconsistent. What we can gather is that as a child she went by Jean, and almost all articles from the 40s call her Jean, and her full name was likely Geraldine. As an adult, she goes by Jerry. So, for consistency's sake, we will refer to her as Jerry. With that being said, we will rejoin Joan and Jerry in the moments after the storm. When the storm dissipated, those who were left uninjured started looking for others to help. The Croft girls were quickly discovered by a neighbor looking for survivors. Mary Carter personally carried Joan Gay to the nearby Woodward Hospital, but by the time they got there, around 9:30 p.m., it was overrun. In the chaos, the hospital started putting the bodies of the recently deceased out on the front lawn, as they had the seriously injured to attend to, and the morgue was overwhelmed. Since the girls were not critically injured, they were taken to the basement, where some of the overflow patients were being held. They were given name tags that had notes underneath that they were to be transported to Oklahoma City, where many of the less critically injured were to be taken. When Mary Carter left, they were lying side by side, and rescue workers informed her that the girls would be sent to a hospital together. What transpired next is another place where accounts differ greatly. All accounts generally agree that 2 men in khaki clothing approached Joan Gay and Jerry around 11 or midnight. The Oklahoman Times claims Jerry had said, quote, "2 men came into the basement and got Joan Gay. It was still dark. Joan Gay cried when she said she wanted to stay with her sister." Her grandfather, Ray Goebel, said that a nurse had questioned the men on their way out. Quote, "The nurse stopped them, and they told her they were taking her out of this mess and going to care for her in Washington. That was about 2 hours after the storm." Nurse Bess Irwin was the one the men had spoken to, and she said they'd actually stopped her to tell her that they were taking Joan Gay. But that night was so chaotic and violent that she said that particular incident is, quote, "vague to me now." Hospital workers did confirm with both the Red Cross and the Highway Patrol that both girls had been tagged for transport to Oklahoma City. The Seminole producer's son claimed that Jerry had not actually witnessed the abduction, but several bystanders had seen the men load Joan Gay onto a stretcher. Olin himself said that Jerry had witnessed it. However, the Oklahoman contradicts itself later and said that the last person to see Joan Gay was Miss Clyde Taylor, one of their neighbors. She recalled seeing her in the hospital basement. Whatever the case may be, there were witnesses who saw 2 men wearing khaki carry Joan out of the basement on a stretcher. The National Guard was on scene, and the men could have either been 2 members of the Guard or had simply donned khaki in an attempt to look like legitimate rescue workers. in all the chaos, and with all of her immediate family critically injured, it would be days before anyone would realize that Joan Gay likely never made it to that hospital. The next morning, around 11 a.m., Jerry was taken to the Crippled Children's Hospital. She was released on April 19th and never saw her sister at that hospital. Accounts differ on what happened with Olin those first few days, but the Daily Oklahoman did interview him in 1947, so we will go with the account from the man himself. Olin had been too critically injured to be aware of anything that was happening. Quote, "I was still unconscious under the rubble of our house when the children were taken to the Woodward Hospital. Later I was taken to the same hospital, but I was removed about daylight to the Baker Hospital. Then I was taken to the home of some friends. It was 2 days before I was able to start looking for her personally, but my wife's people began trying to find her as soon as the storm was over. They missed her because they didn't know anyone had been taken to the hospital basement. The next day, she was gone." While Olin and Jerry recovered, the rest of the town was in chaos. But help had actually started arriving the night of the tornado, and the papers would later find out why. L.L. Arl was the wire chief of the Southwestern Bell Telephone Company, and after the storm destroyed his house, he climbed up a phone pole in the wind and rain and tied 2 broken lines together. He then climbed down after connecting a phone. He then sent the message to the rest of the country that Woodward was in dire need of help. Though the stories of L.L. Arl's heroism had been exaggerated over the years, he likely did get the word out, because ambulances and relief workers arrived incredibly fast. By 7 a.m. the next day, ambulances had started bringing loads of people to Oklahoma City. Wichita and Oklahoma City were both well over 100 miles away, but the hospitals nearby were absolutely not equipped to handle the estimated 1,000 wounded. The Salvation Army, Red Cross, Oklahoma Highway Patrol, and the National Guard all banded together to transport the wounded, distribute food, and set up emergency housing. It was difficult to navigate the streets due to all the debris, so many of the injured were taken to Woodward or further hospitals by boxcar, as the train tracks were quickly cleared. One reporter who showed up said he'd been to London after the Blitz, and the sight of Woodward that morning greatly resembled a city that had been bombed. Though the phone operator unions were still squabbling with management, enough emergency workers in the area remained at their posts to keep the papers well informed. They listed the known dead, and the Miami News Record mistakenly listed that Olin had died rather than Cleta. Olin's sister Nellie actually saw the death announcements of both Olin and Cleta in different papers. She and her husband rushed to Woodward to adopt Joan Gay, but then got the happy news that her brother was in fact alive. The paper that mentions this was largely focused on Joan Gay's disappearance, so it's possible they were planning on adopting both girls, and the article just didn't mention this. But some sources say that Jerry was from Cleta's previous marriage. So maybe they only wanted to adopt Olin's daughter, and see about Jerry's family possibly wanting to take her in. It had snowed shortly following the storm, which made it harder yet to find the bodies that had not been located. A large group of Mennonites showed up that day, rushing right into cleaning debris from the streets and repairing the treacherously damaged buildings. They refused any free food offered, not wanting to take away from the recently homeless. Countless people showed up to volunteer, and the younger and inexperienced ones were given the safer jobs, like peeling potatoes and preparing supplies for the survivors, as there were an estimated 3,000 people left without homes. As survivors succumbed to their injuries in the days and weeks following the calamity, the death toll grew, and even papers written recently cannot agree on the total number. Wikipedia lists the estimated deaths in Woodward at 107, and the total deaths at 181 across the tri-state area, which is close to the average listed in different sources, but a bit high. A week later, on April 17th, the papers started reporting on both the unidentified dead and those who were still missing. There were 2 unidentified children and 1 unidentified baby, and 4 people were missing, including Joan Gay. The missing were an adult couple, the Owens, and 1 William Starnes, none of whom could match the unidentified dead, except Joan Gay. Most sources agree the unidentified girl was around 3 or 4 and had blonde hair, though decades later, the Woodward Times would say she had decidedly strawberry blonde hair. An article in the Wichita Daily Times says that Joan was 5 and claims the other identified girl was 5 years old as well, but that relatives say it was not Joan. This was the only article from the 40s that claims Joan's relatives were able to look at the girl before burial to determine if it was her or not. On April 20th, state officials speculated to the media that Joan Gay may have been buried under the wrong name. They'd searched the nearby hospitals where the injured had been distributed to, but found absolutely no record of her. They'd checked all hospitals in Oklahoma as well as in the neighboring states. The injured had been taken as far as Wichita, Kansas. Highway Patrol Chief H.B. Lowry said, quote, "The last thing we know of Joan, she was lying among the injured on the floor of the hospital. Of course it was dark in there, and the confusion was terrible. She may have died and been carried to the morgue along with dozens of other bodies. The stick injury to her calf would not have been enough to be fatal, but she was not examined for internal injuries." An unnamed spokesman for Oklahoma City said, quote, "We are not discounting the possibility that this child has been buried under another name if she died. A case of mistaken identity would have been possible in the Woodward morgues, though the Highway Patrol and Red Cross both insisted that she would not have died of her injuries." Her father told local investigators that Joan was an incredibly shy girl and might not talk to a stranger at all, even just to say her name. Olin said she had 3 faint scars on her forehead, as well as scars on her arms and stomach from smallpox. Later articles say this was actually chickenpox. June 5th of 1947 was the first mention in the papers of the 2 men who had stolen Joan Gay. By this time, Olin had interviewed all of the doctors, as well as Croft's family doctor, to see if he'd heard any word from other medical professionals. He said, quote, "They were supposed to keep a record of all persons removed from the hospital, but none of them had a record of her." Croft said he was only aware of 2 unidentified children, a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old. There was initially an unidentified 2-year-old, but her family did come forward to claim her. This did confuse other papers about the other 3 Jane Does, but the consensus is that there was an 18-month-old baby, a girl of 3 or 4, and a 12-year-old girl. Olin did not seem to be aware at this time that there had been a Jane Doe the same age as his daughter, and she would have certainly been buried by this point. That day, Olin told the Oklahoman, quote, "I don't know what to do now. The Red Cross and Highway Patrol are still working on it. I asked the FBI for help, but they said they would not have jurisdiction unless there was positive proof of kidnapping." He gave the papers a detailed description of her and what to watch out for. Croft said Joan Gay was, quote, "an unusually pretty child. Her hair is light blonde and hangs just a trifle below her shoulders. She had bangs reaching almost to her eyebrows. She talked plainly for a child her age, but she was bashful around strangers, and I doubt if a stranger could understand her when she pronounced her name. It sounded more like Joe Gay when she said it." Less than 2 weeks later, on June 16th of 1947, a young blonde girl was found badly beaten in a field behind a dance hall in Weed, California. She had a strong resemblance to Joan Gay and was about the right age. The girl had been recovering in a hospital for 10 days and still couldn't identify herself. So the media started to speculate that she could have been Joan Gay. The little girl even seemed to respond to the name Joe Gay. However, The man suspected to have fled the scene was caught, and the girl was identified as his stepdaughter, Mary Jane Medlin. He left her there after the girl's mother, Lucille Medlin, had beaten the girl and ordered her husband, Hugh Gilreath, to take her away and dispose of her, because she was, quote, too much trouble. Once the girl recovered, she was placed back into the care of her biological father, who had initially fought for custody, but lost. Though this incident did not pan out, it helped ignite interest in Joan's case in other states. On July 29th, a description of Joan Gay was shared with highway patrolmen in Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico. Because the FBI did not get involved, the Highway Patrol decided to stay on the case. They'd been put on it because they were the law enforcement agency that had largely been handling the aftermath of the tornado. And although it might have been good to have a traditional detective on the case, it worked out well. Because they were Highway Patrol, they were able to easily coordinate with other states and had jurisdiction to tell other Highway Patrol officers to keep an eye out for the girl. Had they not been the responding agency, it's possible Joan's case might not have made the papers in other states at all. On August 15th, the Pampa Daily News reported the search was still underway. Many news stories about Joan Gay mentioned her chunky build and that she was very bashful. Her grandfather, Ray Goebel, gave his number to the media to please call him with any leads, and local police fielded calls from various sightings in Texas, none of which panned out. Olin and Ray drove to nearby towns and passed out flyers with Joan's picture and gave out her description across local news networks, but they didn't get any useful leads. With that, the story dropped out of the news until the one-year anniversary. Ray Goebel said, quote, I have looked for her from the Rio Grande on the south to the northern Rockies, all summer resorts and playgrounds. Orphanages with unidentified children, called Major Henry Lowry of the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, and Trooper Harold Stafford, who was heading the investigation. Many of the children matched her description, but none were Joan Gay. The troopers told the media that they were currently leaning towards Joan having died and been buried under the wrong name, or that she was kidnapped from the hospital. But the one-year anniversary news wasn't all bad. The town of Woodward was starting to recover. In a piece written on April 9th, the Ponca City News talked about how the town had completely rebuilt the school system, a fire hall, numerous city offices, and even added 10 new buildings to the small downtown area. They'd made a memorial to the survivors, and the houses had been rebuilt. Following the one-year anniversary, Joan Gay's case largely fell out of the media, save for several anniversary pieces written by Bob Lee, who would later formalize his pen name as Robert E. Lee. He wrote a few articles in the Woodward News that have not been digitized, but he made mention of them in later reports. In 1967, Lee moved to the Daily Oklahoman, so his anniversary articles began to become available. These articles were widely circulated by the Associated Press and brought a lot of attention to the case, but were not always 100% consistent with other reports. Although, as we mentioned earlier, the Woodward News has not been digitized, so it's possible these articles are actually more reflective of the truth and contain information found only in those articles. The first available article written by Lee was published April 9th of 1967 in the Daily Oklahoman. It was structured a bit odd and contained quite a bit of speculation. Here is the full intro. Quote, somewhere this Sunday morning, a 24-year-old housewife will arise, prepare breakfast for her family, and begin getting the children ready for Sunday school. It will be a normal Sunday in her life, but, unknown to her, it will also be the 20th anniversary of the most important, frightening, and unusual day in her life. 2 decades ago Sunday, on April 9th, 1947, she suddenly became one of 4 mystery victims of a monstrous tornado that raced 150 miles across Texas and Oklahoma and almost destroyed the city of Woodward. Another odd bit near the end continues the speculative narrative and reads as follows. Quote, as a 24-year-old dressing her children for Sunday school this Sunday, she may wonder a moment about her own childhood, why her parents did not talk to her about the first 4 years of her life. The article goes on to claim a few other things that are very dramatic but not consistent with other sources. The article says 200 blocks of the city, including businesses and homes, were flattened. Most papers, including modern articles written by the Woodward News, claim it was 100 blocks, and the meticulously accurate Tulsa World later put the number at 30. The article goes on to say that supposedly so many birds were killed by the storm that it was nearly a month before townspeople spotted the familiar sparrows. Funerals were held for weeks after the disaster in order to give everyone a proper burial. The 3 children were given graves marked with their ages and unidentified, and are just a few of many graves with a death date of April 9th, 1947. For the 12-year-old girl, every school teacher in Woodward came to see her body and tried to identify her, but none could. Then the name of every blonde girl enrolled in school was written down by the teachers, and all the girls were tracked down. No one ever came forward to claim their child. This article also claims that another child in the basement was a witness who heard Joan Gay say she didn't want to leave her sister. And it says that Olin did take his daughter when he left Woodward, but whether Olin did bring Jerry with him is unclear in all major sources. 13 years later, on April 8th, 1979, Lee would write another article. This article claims that the unidentified girl around Joan's age was actually informally identified by neighbors. They said that she came from a bad home life and was being raised by her grandmother in Woodward. Allegedly, the grandmother was brought in to look at the girl, but she did not want to accept the death of the child she had been raising and refused to admit the girl was hers. Despite neighbor testimony, this legally meant the girl needed to be buried in an unmarked grave. Lee said that the baby was believed to have come from a poor family who knew they could not afford a funeral and thus refused to identify their baby. He does not cite the source for this. This article also claims the quest to identify the 12-year-old girl expanded to every school that had been devastated by the tornado, and that hundreds of teachers came to Woodward to view the body and determine if the girl could be their student. A Tulsa World article from 2007 presents a much more likely story, that a picture of the girl was shown to teachers around the state. It does seem a bit far-fetched that hundreds of teachers were brought into a disaster zone to look at the child when a photograph would have been more efficient and wasted less resources. This article, despite its possible exaggerations, did provide the one and only quote from Jerry available in the media. As an adult, her full name is Jerry Rolls Young, and she said, quote, granted, it would be more than a joy if Joan Gay was found through one of these stories, but the chance is less than 1 million. And perhaps this one quote explains why she only had one quote in the media, as she didn't seem to think writing about the disaster over and over again would produce any viable leads. The story once again dropped out of the media until 1993, when Unsolved Mysteries did a segment on it. This segment may not be 100% reliable. In a similar vein to the Robert E. Lee articles, Robert Stack seems to think it's very likely Joan is alive. In the intro, he says, quote, perhaps with your help, she will be found tonight. Perhaps she will even be watching. Right from the start, there are claims that don't mesh with the established story. This special claims the Crofts were one of Woodward's most wealthy families, saying Olin was a successful sheep rancher. It also says Jerry was 12 and from a previous marriage. The discrepancy between Jerry might have been because Olin, rather than Cleta, actually likely had a 12-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, though she was living with her mother. a distant relative of Olin named Ronnie Croft went through and did a detailed family history sometime in the early 2000s, and some of his findings can be found on the popular obituary website findagrave.com. He said that Olin had been married to one Hazel Linus Blaisdell, and together they had Carol Dean Croft. When the two were divorced in 1939, Carol stayed with her mother. Carol would have been 4 years old at the time, and it's unclear if she stayed in contact with her father at all, or if she had ever met her half-sisters. Ronnie's obituary on Olin also may have shed some light on the discrepancy between modern sources claiming Olin was exceptionally wealthy, and a complete lack of this in any primary sources from the time. The Oklahoman article from June 5, 1947, says Olin was an implement company worker, and this was one of the only articles that interviewed Olin directly. However, we know from Ronnie Croft's work that Olin's family were wealthy ranchers, and he'd actually moved to Woodward to be closer to them after his divorce from his first wife. But he did not work on the farm. It had been left to an uncle, whose family owned the farm until 2011. He'd worked there as a kid, but just helped out. The obituary also claims Olin and Cleta got married in 1942, which would in fact mean Jerry was from another marriage. This obituary goes on to say that Olin remarried in the summer of 1947 to one Rita Medeline Carlton, and the two moved to San Antonio, where they had 2 children, Karen and Kendall. He died in 1987. None of Ronnie Croft's history helped to clear up the question of whether or not he took Jerry in after the disaster. Aside from this information about Olin, perhaps the most prominent element to the Unsolved Mysteries special were testimonies from both Ruth Bond, Joan Gay's aunt, and Marvella Parks, her cousin. Neither of them had really been quoted in the media at all before, and Ruth's testimony doesn't 100% line up with previously known facts. But this was decades later, and the papers at the time didn't really interview any of the women involved in Joan Gay's life. They didn't speak with the neighbor who carried her from the rubble, didn't really question Bess Irwin, and out of all the articles written in 1947, only one even used Cleta's first name. So it's possible the women had been trying to tell their stories before, but nobody was listening. Ruth Bond remembered Joan Gay fondly. Quote, "She was the most prettiest little girl I'd ever seen. She was just perfect. She said she was so shy when a stranger came around that she would hide behind her mother's dress." Marvella had been only 14 when the tornado struck. She said the tornado only lasted 4 or 5 minutes, but felt like an eternity. Her family was lucky. Her house had only broken windows and minor damage. Marvella and Ruth went to Woodward Hospital shortly after the wind died down, because Ruth hadn't been able to find her mother or brother. Marvella recalled, quote, "We stepped over bodies. Some of them had their skull all cut off, and some of them their throats cut. Some of them was dead. It was just like wartime if they dropped a bomb." They mentioned Betty Irwin by name as the nurse that told them Joan Gay and Jerry were in the basement. Granted, they called her Betty, not Bess, but it's probably the same woman. This lends some credibility to their story. Ruth said that when they got to the basement, she opted to not tell the children their mother was dead. Quote, "I didn't let on like I even knew, 'cause that wouldn't help those girls at all. They'd have just went hysterical." When they went outside, Ruth found her mother and brother, and her mother was very injured. They took her to Moreland Hospital, where Ruth started helping the wounded. When she returned, Joan Gay was gone. This conflicts with Olin's story that none of Cleta's friends or family had been able to locate the girls that night. Days later, Ruth got a call from a funeral director, Franklin Stetcher. He told the show there had been 2 bodies left over, which conflicts with even modern reports that said 3. This episode claims the 4-year-old had a strong resemblance to Joan Gay, so they called Ruth in to identify her. Olin would have been back in town by then, though, so it's unclear why they wouldn't call him. Ruth had brought some of Joan's clothes with her, and Stetcher told Ruth that Joan's clothes were too big for the girl they'd found, but she insisted on seeing the body anyway. She said it wasn't her. Quote, "I was really relieved that wasn't our little Joan Gay." About the abduction, Ruth also dropped a previously unheard element about the men in khaki. She said they asked the nurse specifically for the Croft children. As with Robert Ely's articles, just because Ruth's testimony does not line up with sources from the time does not mean it's not true. Her version could actually be the more accurate one, but it's concerning that it conflicts with the few papers that Ogle spoke to before he dropped out of the spotlight. However, these discrepancies could simply be because no one interviewed Ruth until 26 years after Joan Gay disappeared, and memory changes greatly over time. Plus, Ogle stopped speaking to the media rather quickly, and perhaps didn't have all of the right information when he was being interviewed at first. After the special aired, Marvella was put in charge of fielding the leads generated by Unsolved Mysteries. The first time the show aired in September of 1993, she got leads and phone calls on over 400 people who thought they might be Joan Gay. She talked to a good majority of the ones who sounded credible, but said, quote, "No one sounded right." In 1994, Gene Smith from Phoenix, Arizona, watched the episode of Unsolved Mysteries that aired about the case. She'd caught it on a rerun in 1993 because Smith's daughter-in-law had actually watched the original airing, and tipped Smith off that there was a girl mentioned on it that could have been her. Smith's family was well aware that she was in the process of trying to find out who she really was, because Smith had suspected for several years at that point that the people who raised her were not her parents. She said that throughout her whole life, she would occasionally get flashbacks to memories and people that she can't place. Anytime she's tried to bring this up to her parents, though, they told her she was imagining things. Jean said, quote, "I never felt like I belonged to the people who raised me. I knew I was just different from them. I didn't look like any of them. My children don't resemble any of them. And I couldn't remember anything about myself from before the time I was about 6 years old." She said she was later diagnosed with psychogenic amnesia. This is what is more commonly known as having repressed memories, or selective amnesia caused by trauma rather than a physical injury to the brain. Smith had good reason to believe that she was not in fact Lavina Jean Smith, as her birth certificate claimed. Apparently, local police and the FBI both worked with Jean and determined that she had found enough evidence to prove that the people who raised her were not her biological parents. Smith had gone to Phoenix police with her birth certificate and baby pictures. They compared her footprints to the baby's footprints and realized they were not a match. They also agreed with her that her baby pictures very clearly did not appear to be her. But neither law enforcement nor Jean herself could get answers out of her supposed parents, because by the time Jean found this evidence, her father, coincidentally also named Ogle, last name Randall, was in a mental institution, and her mother was in a nursing home. Jean Smith had actually started seeing a psychoanalyst about 3 years before she saw the program on Unsolved Mysteries. During these visits, they began to go through hypnosis to try and recover her childhood memories. She started to remember violent scenes of people dying and seeing terribly injured people. When she started to think she might be Joan Gay, she realized that she might actually be remembering the Woodward Tornado. Smith had said that the first time she watched the Unsolved Mysteries special, quote, "It was just incredible. It was as if the writer had been in my head, showing everything just the way I would have remembered." Smith's birth certificate places her as being born in Boise, Idaho, on December 15th, 1941. Joan Gay Croft's birth certificate was from October 28th, 1942. This is less than a year of difference, but Smith thinks it could be relevant, as she claims that as she was growing up, multiple teachers suspected she might actually be younger than she officially was. Intrigued by all of this information, Marvella decided to pay a visit to Jean. Parks said that as soon as she met Jean, she asked her to see the scar on her leg. Quote, "I couldn't wait any longer. I had to know. So I asked her to show me her leg, and yes, there were the scars from the splinter that went through it." Marvella's husband, Lon, also lived through the Woodward Tornado, and he has numerous small scars on his back from glass being embedded in his skin. Jean had similar scar patterns on her other leg. Ruth also visited Jean and determined that her story was very credible. She said Joan had a lisp as a child and that Jean lisped when she got excited. Ruth also looked at pictures of Jean around age 19 and swore she looked just like Cleta had at that age. Her blood type matched Joan Gay as well. With this, they went to the media, and in April of 1994, papers were eager to pick up the case. Parks told the Woodward News, quote, "This is like a bolt of electricity. I've been on cloud 9 this week." Ruth Bond said, quote, "I know in my heart that it is her." Jean drove to Woodward in June and said it felt like home when she arrived. Jean said, quote, "Anytime I say my name or write my name always felt wrong. When I use Joan Gay Croft, it feels good." Smith contacted Olin's sister, Nellie Burwell. Nellie met with Jean and soon told her that she didn't need any more proof. She was certain Jean was Joan Gay. But Jean said, quote, "I told her I couldn't be satisfied until I've had the DNA test, to have the evidence to take before a judge who can give me back my real name." The DNA was to be tested against Olin's younger children. Producers of Unsolved Mysteries agreed to pay for the DNA testing. Joan Gay's sister declined to have her DNA compared. However, despite all of the promising evidence, in October, the DNA test ruled conclusively that Jean Smith was not Joan Gay. The test ruled there was a 256-1 chance that Smith could be the child. The odds were very against Jean being Joan Gay. But Jean wasn't quite ready to believe the odds. Smith had said she'd found another lead because she has a picture of herself as a child with a shaved head, and she'd found a sighting of someone claiming to have spotted a girl in Texas who closely matched Joan Gay. The anonymous woman claimed that a young couple moved in next door with a little girl with a shaved head, but aside from that, the girl looked very similar to the pictures of Joan Gay that had circulated in the media. If she is Joan Gay, perhaps her parents had shaved her head to make her less recognizable, as many papers mentioned Joan Gay's fluffy blonde hair. Jean went to continue her quest, but her story fell out of the media with the DNA test putting the odds against her. Though the leads from the show hadn't panned out, Marvella went on to continue to be a voice in the media, not only for Joan, but for other victims of the tornado. In January of 1997, the town of Woodward started making plans to erect a memorial for the estimated 16 children who died in the disaster. The memorial was going to be in the new middle school cafeteria. The cafeteria had actually been remodeled the previous fall, and during construction, dozens of bricks from the old school that had been destroyed in the tornado were recovered. Marvella was one of the leaders working to put the memorial together, and said they hadn't even been able to determine the names of all of the children who died. Quote, "We have a very big job to determine who the children were, because we have had so many various lists of names. Back then there were misspellings, there were fatalities listed, but people were not killed. We're having to sort the adults' names from the children's names." Parks and her husband were hoping to be able to figure out all of the names in time to put the plaque up on April 9th. The next year, in 1998, another woman came forward with a very promising story. Marvella was still fielding numerous calls, some of which seemed promising. Some women even had scars on their legs that could have been from a piece of wood. The most promising lead was a woman who came forward from Canada. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and her name was Joan Gay Parks. This Joan Gay claimed to have belongings that had Olin and Cleta's names on it, along with personal photographs of the Croft family. However, She didn't currently have the evidence, as those items belonged to an aunt, but said she was trying to get them back. Perhaps the most intriguing bit of alleged evidence the woman claimed to have was a charcoal drawing that was signed O. Croft. Olin's third wife confirmed to Parks that Olin did like to draw. This was one of many personal facts that Marvella kept closely guarded to weed out potential hoaxers. The Canadian woman had relatives with the last name Goebel, just like Joan's grandfather, and she claims they had neighbors with the last name Croft. The Oklahoman article that covered this part of the story did not say the family had lived in Oklahoma, but it strongly implied she was trying to say the Crofts were her neighbors. The woman did talk about a deadly tornado that her older relatives spoke of, but Parks acknowledges that this part of the story does not line up with Joan Gay's experience during the tornado, and may have been a different tornado altogether. The Canadian woman believes that her family must have looted the Croft family home in the wake of the disaster, then enlisted the help of hospital workers to steal Joan after seeing photos of her. However, this woman cannot provide any proof that her family ever lived in Oklahoma. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were helping to investigate, but evidently nothing came of this lead, and this woman was never mentioned in the papers again. So, it was likely a hoax. In 2012, Robert E. Lee wrote a piece for the Oklahoman about a series of strange emails he received in 1999 that he'd never found the answers to. Like with Lee's other articles, this should be taken with a grain of salt, as this article claims Joan had the splinter removed. This is not true. It's established in every article found otherwise that the splinter was not treated, as it would need to be handled by medical professionals. Taking it out in a non-hospital setting could have caused her to lose considerable amounts of blood. But the article was mainly Lee wanting to bring attention back to these strange emails and see if that woman was still out there. On April 12, 1999, he got the following email. Quote, Mr. Lee, I know that you have written many articles about the 1947 Woodward Tornado and about the missing Joan Gay Croft. How would you like to write an article about what really happened to Joan Gay and where she has been this past 54 years? She has been and is living in OKC off and on since 1956 under a different name with the full knowledge of her father, Orlin Croft. She even graduated from an OKC high school under a different name. If you want more information, please contact Joan Gay at Redacted, Miss Joan Gay Croft. He responded to the email, but did not say what made up his response. She wrote back on May 2nd. Quote, Mr. Lee, I know this time of year there are many people who crawl out of the woodwork claiming to be the lost girl. But I was never physically lost. My immediate family knew where I was. I just didn't know who I was. Until just lately, I never faced the fact that Cleta Croft, my mother, died upon me. I buried this information deep within my long-term memory and refused to accept. If you want to know the rest, email me at Redacted. We will arrange to meet in person to discuss the details. I propose we meet at Penn Square for the first meeting. I would like to meet in public, but not publicly and without photos. Please let me know a time and date convenient for you. I am on the internet, at most, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, between 9 and 10:30 a.m. As to compensation, I would prefer none. Yours, Joan Gay Croft. He responded that he would absolutely like to know more, and in an effort to connect with her, told her that his wife had also been a survivor of the Woodward Tornado, but she never responded back. However, on both letters, she added an E to Gay, misspelling Joan's name, and called Joan's father the wrong name entirely. Also, Cleta had been completely crushed under a wall of the house. If she died upon Joan Gay would also have been crushed as well. It was very likely this was just an elaborate hoax. With this final article, Robert E. Lee dropped out of the media. Despite the possible inconsistencies in his work, he'd been a major voice for Joan's case, and without him covering it, her case largely stopped receiving attention. In 2016, NBC interviewed Marvella about her theories. She said, quote, "We always thought maybe somebody took her that had lost their daughter somewhere over the years at some time, and they took her to take the place of the one they had lost." She also told them that she's put her DNA into several databases used by law enforcement to help solve cold cases, and hopes that maybe someday it will yield answers. After she became involved in the 1997 memorial, and after learning so much about the children lost in the tornado, Marvella continued to be a voice for Joan and the other children. Every spring around the anniversary of the April 9th tornado, Marvella visits the graves of the unnamed children. Park said she would really like to see the other girls identified. Quote, "It's such a mystery. Who are these little girls? Where did they come from? Where are their families? They can't be forgotten." The Woodward Daily News in 2016 either cleared up or brought more rumors to the scene regarding the 3 Jane Does. The article claims that the local rumors about the girls were that they might have all been from the same very poor family, who may have elected not to claim the girls as they couldn't afford a funeral. Perhaps no one knew the girls because the family had just recently moved to town, or they were simply passing through. This article was the last mention of the girls in recent memory. Articles written this decade are unfortunately becoming less and less accurate when compared to contemporary sources. Many news articles also exaggerate Joan's protests when she was taken, saying she was screaming and crying and all of the hospital staff ignored her. This is greatly exaggerated. Even in the chaos, hospital staff would probably have noticed an obvious kidnapping like that. NBC claims that the men who took her told her they were coming back for her sister and that hospital staff stopped them, and they told the staff they were taking the girls to a hospital where they had family being treated. A November 19, 2020 article from the Muskogee Daily Phoenix adds the element that the men claimed to be friends of the family who were taking her to a hospital where their family was waiting. Many of the theories that you'll find online about Joan Gay actually center on some of the things we've covered as likely being misinformation. The mystery of the men claiming to be family friends who were taking the girl to see her family seems to be largely made up. They likely only spoke with Betty Irwin to say that they were taking her to Oklahoma City, the hospital the girl had been tagged for. One major theory is that she was stolen for ransom, but this hinged on Olin being one of the most wealthy people in town, and as we've gone over, his family had wealth, but he was an implement worker. Perhaps someone did steal her, knowing that his extended family could possibly pay a ransom. But no call ever came to demand one, though this could be because whoever stole her did not provide the proper medical care and she passed away. Joan Gay could also be the unidentified girl who was the same age as her that has been buried as Jane Doe. Olin never viewed the remains, and the source of the information that neighbors knew who she was an article that presented other possibly untrue information. The little girl has never been exhumed for DNA testing, and it's possible that when Ruth brought the clothes to identify her, she brought Jerry's instead, which would have undoubtedly been too big. This girl did not end up in the morgue until days after Joan was taken, and it's possible that the men were preparing her for transport to Oklahoma City when she succumbed to internal injuries, or the stick in her leg shifted and pierced a major blood vessel. Or it's possible Joan was, in fact, brought by the men to another hospital, where she was then lost in the system. The fact that so many orphanages had so many unidentified children that could have been her seems to at least make this a possibility. Or she may have been buried in Woodward under another child's name by mistake, as Marvella learned in 1997. There's not even an agreed-upon death count for just the children who perished in the tornado. Then there is the theory that the men were stealing her. The only source that says they asked for the Croft children specifically was from Ruth, who is recounting the story 20 years later, so this may have not been true. If the men were pedophiles, as some people think, they may have simply donned khaki in order to pass themselves off as National Guardsmen, and then went to peruse for a child to take in the chaos. or the men were looking because they were selling younger children to wealthy families looking to adopt illegitimate children, which, as we saw with Gene Smith, was absolutely not unheard of. Then there is the possibility that Gene Smith was right. Her DNA was only tested against Olin's other children. If Olin had not actually been Joan Gay's father, of course the DNA would not match. This is not hinted at anywhere, but is something that should be considered when so much of the other evidence pointed to Gene. An obituary published in the White Mountain Independent on March 30th of 2010 lists one, Lavina Jean Smith, daughter of Olin Randall and Lavina Meredith Wilson. She was 67 at the time of her death, which would make her the right age to be the same Gene Smith who came forward in 1994, and her father has the same first and last name. This obituary did list her birth name, but said that she had been going by the name Joan Croft. Apparently Jean, after trying to explore her past, had decided that she was in fact Joan, despite the DNA test proving otherwise. Though the case has never been solved, Gene Smith at least found the answers she was looking for. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include Unsolved Mysteries and the Daily Oklahoman. For a full list of sources, as well as links to our sponsors and contributors, please see our show notes. Please rate or review on your chosen app and follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.